So today is Life Day.
That's the spirit. You'll be celebrating Life Day before you know it.
And what better way to celebrate that horrendous Christmas special by painting up Chewbacca and Han Solo? I'm kicking it off with a simple assembly. These guys build just one way. And then I make sure I clean up any flash with an X-Acto knife. And then I use plastic glue to glue the pieces together. I'll then switch to a super glue to glue them onto the base. I'm doing my regular priming in black first. I prefer to use Monument Hobbies primer. This is from their Pro Acryl series, and I find that it does flow through the airbrush really nicely. Primers can be a little bit thicker than regular paint, and this doesn't really require too much thinning. Once I got a black all over on these models, I'll then go in with a white, and I typically aim for about 45 degrees from above. This helps pull out some of the highlighted areas and some of the areas that I need to focus on later on. And for Chewbacca, I'm just adding just a little bit more white than usual because I'll be using a speed paint on top. And for that, I'm using dark wood. And so I turn the PSI right the way down on the airbrush and just let the paint come out pretty thick on the model. You can see it's kind of splattering, but then once you add another coat, it does kind of blend together. You could of course use a brush to apply this, but I'm just trying to save some time with the airbrush here. And once those coats are dry, we're jumping straight into the base colors. So I'm going to be using Balor Brown, and this is just a regular Citadel paint. I'm hoping to get a nice wet blend transition between these two colors, but obviously the first color has already dried by this point. So what I've decided to do is kind of reverse it, and I'm just adding in these pale areas, these tan areas on Chewbacca, aiming for his feet and hands first. I'm not too worried about wet blending it at this stage, just getting these main areas patched in. I'm taking a little bit of care around the face, but again, we're at the early stages, so I'm just kind of rushing through this. And really, I'm just aiming to get a nice flat coverage on some of these tan areas. And then I've taken that dark wood and I've watered it right the way down with some medium. And now I'm applying that over the seam between the two colors. I'm hoping to kind of blend the two colors together here. I'm also taking a damp brush and help feathering that edge just a little bit. And you can see it hides that seam really nicely and kind of blends between the two. Now I'm using a Seraphim Sepia wash, and I'm just applying this to those Balor Brown sections. This helps to pull back into those shadows, that initial brown that was lost with the base coat. I'm using Agrax Earthshade. This is a darker shade, and I'm using this for just all of the other areas of fur. Some of the contrast paint got a little thin on top here. You can kind of see it's getting that pale look to it. So I'm reintroducing that brown and those saturated colors on top with this shade. I'm strategically applying this shade just to these dark sections and avoiding the Seraphim shaded areas. And then I've gone back in with that Balor Brown and just added a couple quick highlights just to pull out some of those areas that may have gotten a little too dark with that initial Seraphim shade. I'm not necessarily looking to follow too many contours of the fur or the sculpt or anything. I'm just trying to pull back in some of that color. Next up, we're using Ochre by Scale Color. And now I am starting to focus on some of the sculpted details and some of that fur texture. I'm not looking to get too minute, I'm just kind of following these ridges here. But I'm just adding this as an initial highlight just to kind of introduce the idea of light filtering through the fur. You could really take this as far as you wanted. It's not necessarily set in stone, so I just wanted to add a few highlights to this. It's maybe a little too exaggerated, but for the most part, it kind of matches that cartoony Shatterpoint style. And now we're using a favorite paint here, Deck Tan, and I'm starting to introduce this as a core highlight to Chewbacca. So I'm really only using this sparingly. I'm trying to feather the strokes here to make it look a little bit more like fur. And I'm really just focusing it on any of the upturned areas, not necessarily underneath the arms or anything like that. Rhinox hide is going to be my main highlight for the rest of the fur. So it's already pretty close to this, but I'm just adding this to kind of reinforce the idea that this is going to be a highlighted area. And it helps to uniform any of those areas that may have gotten a little bit too pale with the initial contrast paint. I'm introducing some Deck Tan into that Rhinox hide and just using this as my basis for highlighting and doing this in stages and just kind of building up to that Deck Tan color. And then after that was done, I decided it may be a little bit too gray, so I ended up going back in with an Agrax and just toning that whole shade down. I'm using a pretty simple grim black for any of the black details, so the gun and the IG droid arm that's in his hand. I'm also using this for his fingers and toes. And of course, his iconic bowcaster. It's time to work on the details on the face, and I'm starting off with a bright neutral grey. I find that if you do the eyes in white and then you do a black, they can kind of look a little googly. So if you do a grey, it's a little bit more natural and it sinks back into the face a little bit more. It doesn't stand out as bold. You can see that here I kind of overspilled a little bit. I'm just going back and forth trying to get some of those details on the eyes. So then I just go back in with that Balor brown and just cover up some of the mistakes and try again. I'm also adding just some pure black for his nose. And then for the lips, I'm using pink flesh. And this kind of blends into his fur just a little bit, so I'm not worried about just overspilling that on his lips here. I'm also getting his tongue with the same color. And then back in with that neutral grey for his teeth. The top set of teeth can be a little bit tricky because of the angle, but if you're just patient, you can go back and forth between the colors until you get it the way you like it. And then I'm just adding a dab of Carroburg Crimson into his mouth just to help shade that tongue and those recesses into a deeper red. Here I'm using Mournfang Brown, and this is going to be the base coat for the bandolier and the satchel. Nothing too special about this, just a straight application on top. And then it can be quite tricky to get it into those recesses on the bandolier, so I'm really just focusing on the main straps. I'm letting that initial dark wood coat just kind of fill in the gaps there. And I'm using that neutral grey for these metal pouches that are in the bandolier. I'm just using the edge of the brush to add some highlights. I'm starting to mix in a Deck Tan into some of these browns rather than a white. I find that the white will completely desaturate the brown, you'll lose that warmth. And then finally, a quick dry brush on some of the weapons, the IG droid that's on the ground there, and the arm that he's holding. This is just a grayscale. I've mixed up a white and a medium grey and just dry brushing some of these details on. I'm doing my traditional Shatterpoint style bases, which is a Skrag brown for any of the areas of dirt. And because his base is just a little bit different, I'm making sure that I get a fairly decent coverage over all these rocks and rubble and things first. I then use a fairly dark grey for any of the metallic areas. So there's still some poking through the base, so I'm just adding this. And then I decided to fill in some of the gap here with a Vallejo texture paint. There was a gap between the model and the base, so I just used this to kind of fill that in. And I decided to add an Agrax Earthshade just over the whole thing. Finally, I dry brush with an Irocco just to pull out some of those details and to help this match the other Shatterpoint bases that I have. I'm using a burnt rust pigment and just dabbing this on strategically in different places. This adds a little bit more warmth, helps make it look a little bit more dusty, and adds a level of realism. Finally, Chewbacca is done with a black rim of the base. Next up is the scruffy nerf herder, Han Solo himself. So I'm going to be using a lot of the existing colors because these guys are a duo and I want them to kind of look like they've got the same color scheme. So this is Rhinox hide, and I'm using this for his main trousers here. I'm applying this just as a base coat because we're going to tackle him in pretty much the same way we did Chewbacca. And then deck tan for his shirt. I'm going for the Return of the Jedi look, so his trousers are different, and I think some of the colors on his vest and his shirt are different. And then pure black just for the belt that's underneath his holster. For the holster itself, I'm using that Skrag brown. This is a nice leathery brown, and just a simple quick application, applying just a little bit of accuracy for the straps that go around his legs. And then grim black for any of the black areas, so his boots here. And this just really helps me kind of see where those highlights are going to be later on, as well as covering up any gaps that I may have missed between the trousers and the shoes. I'm taking a little bit of care on his vest. Speed paint and contrast paints like this have a tendency to spread really easily, so just carefully applying it to near the edge and then just using the brush just to brush it into that edge and making sure it doesn't overspill onto that deck tan shirt. And you can see it does a really nice job of highlighting those pouches and seams. I'm using Agrax Earthshade, and I'm just applying this to the pants and the holster. I don't want to get too much of this shade onto the black areas and overshade them. And then for the face, we're going to be using Bugman's Glow. This is a really nice base tone for flesh tones. I always use this color, and this initially seems a little too red, but it's great for those shadowed areas once we start adding these highlights. I'm making sure I'm being pretty accurate here. I don't want to get it onto the shirt, but if it does, it's just a simple switch over to deck tan and cover it up. I'm also applying this to his hands as well. Next up is the eyes. This is always this kind of scariest bit, but just keep going back and forth until you get it the way you like it. I try to do like a line almost and then cover it up with that Bugman's Glow. And then I've switched over to the pink flesh that we used earlier for Chewbacca's lips, and this is going to be my main flesh color. So I'm covering up most of this with this pink flesh, but leaving like under his chin and areas around the neck still in that Bugman's Glow. This is also great for kind of a little seam around his hairline and underneath the eyes to leave in that original color. I'm introducing Deck Tan into Pink Flesh and just building up those tones. I'm applying it towards the upper part of the face, so you're going to be looking for areas like the cheeks, the chin and the nose, things that kind of protrude out are going to get more of those highlights. It's going to look kind of goofy for a minute, but you just kind of have to stick with it and just keep building up until eventually I'm going to add just a little dot of Deck Tan onto the nose and the chin as my main highlight. I've added just a small dab of Cloudburst Blue into some of those original flesh tones, and this will help create kind of a stubble look. I did it into the Bugman's Glow. It was a little too dark. You can kind of see here I'm changing my mind. So then I put it into the Pink Flesh and it was perfect. And this just helps add some color into those cheeks and kind of brings the overall pinkness level down into a much more varied appearance. I'm using the Darkwood Speedpaint, and you can kind of see it did really kind of start to separate and thin down here because I've used it quite a lot by this point. So I'm just being extra careful not to get it onto the face. It can be quite watery, so just do it in small dabs. And then a couple small lines for his eyebrows. You can always go back and make them thinner with some of those flesh tones. I'm adding some very basic highlights to the hair. I've got a lot of browns on the palette now, so I'm just kind of mixing in, I think this is Mournfang, and mixing in some Morocco, things like that, just to make these nice warm browns. And I'm just adding a very simple highlight to his hair. And then finally some very small highlights with some Morocco. For his DL44, I'm using some Grim Black. And here's some decayed metal. He's actually standing on one of the droids from Return of the Jedi. I think it's EV9D9. And so this is just a very simple brassy metallic. I'm not looking to go kind of overboard on this because I just want to keep the focus on Han himself. And then finally, I'm starting to add some highlights to his clothing. So this is just a pure titanium white from Pro Acryl. And I'm using this as kind of an edge highlight on the shirt. I don't want to completely make his shirt white, so I'm just using this for the edges and the wrinkles. And then rather than a grayscale highlight, I'm actually going to be introducing some rust gray. This is kind of a blue gray. And I mix this with some black just to make it a shade darker. And this is going to be my highlight for his vest. This just helps to kind of contrast some of the browns and the oranges in those browns, and just adds a little bit of cool blue to another area on the model. I decided to give Evie a quick shade with Agrax. And then I'm mixing in some Deck Tan into that Rhinox hide and just doing some quick highlights on the trousers. Finally, for the base, I'm using dark grey. And this is my usual grey that I use for all of my Shatterpoint bases. I'm going back and just finishing out these final details. So the belt buckle, I decided to go for a non-metallic. You can just use like a gunmetal, but I'm throwing in just some quick grayscale highlights just to make it look like it's shiny. And the iconic stripe down the side, I'm using Tau Light Ochre. This took a couple of coats. You can kind of see the first coat was a little patchy, but that second coat is really nice and vibrant. And then I mixed in just a little bit of white for a highlight. I focused this towards the top and anywhere that it's kind of folded towards his boots. And then for his boots, I'm just kind of mixing up some very quick grayscales. I do this for most of my Shatterpoint miniatures that are in these leather boots. It's just a very, very simple, kind of sketchy highlight. So I mix in the light gray and then I apply that. And then what I do is I kind of find the middle tone and apply that over the seam, and that kind of blends the seam. Pretty much the same way we did the Chewbacca fur at the beginning of the video. And then build up to a white highlight. It's not the smoothest transition, but it kind of gets the idea of like shiny leather across. And then lastly, I'm just dry brushing the base like I normally do. This is a medium gray, and then a white, and then a couple of dabs of blue, which I then kind of feather. And here they are, an iconic duo, Han and Chewie. As always, these Shatterpoint models are such a joy to paint because they're just slightly larger than regular miniatures. So these guys are such a nice palette cleanser from the usual. Plus, anytime I get to practice faces is always a good thing. Sometimes he looks like Harrison Ford and sometimes he looks a little bit like Corey Feldman, so I don't know, that wasn't intentional. But I'm super happy with the result. Chewie came out great, I'm really happy with the wet blend. I probably could have toned down the tan areas just a little bit more to match the brown fur, but I like the stylized look. As always, please let me know what you think in the comments down below. The channel is almost up to 1,000 subs, and I just want to say thank you so much for everybody joining me on this journey. We've almost done a video every week for a full year, which is crazy. I've got some really cool stuff planned for the end of the year as well. If you've enjoyed this content, consider subscribing for more. I've got a lot more videos planned, and dropping a like down below also helps the video. Thank you so much for watching, and have a happy Life Day.